저는 오늘 이 시간
So at this time,
가시의
I will be
은혜라는 제목으로
sharing a
놀라우신 하나님의
message
말씀을
entitled The Grace of
전하겠습니다.
Thorn.
세 가지 포인트를 가지고 있는데
I
첫
have
번째
3
포인트로
points.
나무를
Point number
알면
1,
세상을 안다.
if you know the tree, you can know the
나무를
world.
알면
If you know the tree,
세상을
you can
안다.
know the world.
지금으로부터
So,
대략 40년 전인
from today,
1980년
40 years
미국
ago
서부에
in
있는 워싱턴
1980, in the state of
세인트
Washington in the United States,
라는 산에
there
화산이
was
터졌습니다.
a volcano that erupted called Mount St. Helens. And so we look at the Richter scale, the earthquake was one with a 5.1 degree magnitude, and so the volcano erupted, and at top of the mountain, it completely exploded, and so the top of the mountain actually completely exploded. And so the height of this mountain was 2,950 meters, and through this explosion, 400 meters of it flew away or was exploded. And so it was a great explosion that happened. And so through this eruption, the entire ecosystem was devastated, and the area of the forest that was destroyed was equivalent to the size of Seoul, which is 230 square miles. And so in Korea, we would see this as 600 square kilometers. And so it was a great explosion. And the ecosystem was devastated, and all of the many animals and plant life died. And there were also people who passed as well. And even in this devastated place, as the years passed by, there was new life that sprouted in. And so this is the dignity of life. No matter how much you may be, or something may be crushed or destroyed, when the time comes, there is the work of life that comes about again. But what's interesting is that where this eruption had happened, there was something very strange that happened to the many trees that were hundreds of miles away. And so in these trees, there was gold. And so because these trees were unable to receive sunlight, these trees, in order to live, they deep into the ground, they started to look for copper, and because there was no copper, they started to instead use gold, which was similar to copper. And so for these many trees, there was gold within these trees, and that is what we can know through this event. And so what is there in the tree? For the first small point, there are traces of time in the tree. Small point 1, there are traces of time in the tree. And so when you study the trees, you can find out what the environment was like at that time. And so in the tree, as we know, there is something called tree rings. And the tree rings, if the shape of it or the width of it has changed, whether it's become wider or thinner, the way the tree rings look, we can see that this is because the tree rings reveal the conditions of the year during that time. And so the tree rings, if a tree lives a year or another year, then it gains a new tree ring for each year. So a tree that has been around for 10 years may have many tree rings. And the study of these things, it is called dendrochronology. And so as you study the tree rings, you can find out what the temperature and the rainfall was like during that year. And by looking at the thickness of the tree rings, you can find out how much rain had fell and how cold or hot the weather was. And furthermore, when you observe between the tree rings, you can also estimate how much wind had come in the area, or if there was a hurricane or windstorm, and how strong that wind was. And how can you find that out? It is through the study of the tree rings, or the dendrochronology. And so when there is good sunlight and good water, then the age rings, the tree rings, will get thicker. But rather, on the other hand, if it's dark and it's cold, then the width of the tree rings will become thinner or more narrow. And so a long time ago, those who had lost direction, they would use the tree rings to find their way, and that is what we have heard. And the most important thing is, when you study the age rings, you can find out more about yourself. And so, small point number 2, the tree rings show whether you have lived according to the grain, or the grain texture. And so, each tree ring, it records the many events that has happened over the course of the year. And so the more denser the ring, the more difficult the year has been. And the more denser the tree rings, the wood of the tree becomes more hard. And so the tree rings of the tree shows how the tree has lived during the year. And right now, the word grain or texture, we can see that it refers to a pattern. So we all want to live according to the grain. We want to live according to what our ideal thoughts are and our ideal lives. But as we live life, we're unable to live according to how we want, but we encounter a knot. And so a knot, it is an external wound in the tree. And so there's a tree, but at one point, because of some weather condition, or for example, a hurricane or some windstorm, the tree may become externally damaged or might get wounded. But if this wound is deep, then the inside of the tree will also have some deep trauma. And we call these deep wounds the knots. And so the knots, they reference durability, or rather the ability to endure. And so what is a knot? If we were to look at this more closely, when you are cutting down a tree, for example, you use something like an axe to cut down the tree, but at one point the axe is unable to cut down the tree. And why is that? Because it has encountered a knot. And so in some cases, the axe might actually break, and that is what happens. And the reason this happens is because the axe has met a knot. And so that means that to this tree, there may have been some tremendous wound
알 수 있는
or
거예요.
not that has happened to the tree.
우리가 신앙생활하면서
And so as we live our lives of faith,
그야말로 별 사람들을
we will
만나보고
meet
별
very
일들을
interesting
체험하게
type
됩니다.
of people and very interesting events we may
그러니까
encounter.
문자 그대로
And just as I have said,
뭐 이런 사람이 다 있나 할 정도로
you may think, what kind of person
이런
like this
사람이 교회에
exists?
있지?
How can someone like this be
어떻게
at a
이런
church?
사람이
How
하나님을
can
믿는다고 하지?
someone like this say
저렇게
that they believe in God while they
저렇게
talk like that,
행동하면서.
while they act like that?
그러니까 우리가
And so
그 이제 신앙생활하면서
as we live our lives of
그야말로
faith,
뭐 온갖 사람들을 다 만나고
we'll meet
온갖
all
일들을
sorts of
우리가 다
people
당하는데
and encounter
그러나
all
그
sorts of
어려움을
things.
하나씩
But
이제
with each and every
이겨나가면은
difficulty, as we
이제 그
overcome
사람의
these one by
영성이
one,
이제 깊어지기
the
시작합니다.
person's spirituality
그러니까
deepens. And so
정확하게 지금 우리가
precisely
나무
right
이야기를 하는
now,
것이
we're
아니라
not talking about
우리는
trees,
가시에 대한
but we are
그
talking
이야기를 하고
about
있는
the
거예요.
thorns.
그러니까 가시라는 것을
And so the
어떤
thorns,
식물의
it's not
특징으로만
some
우리가 생각하는
characteristic
것보다는
of
우리가
a
하나님을
plant,
이제
but rather,
믿으면서 우리가
as we believe in God and as we fear God,
우리가 경험하는 우리가
the things
맞이하는
we
그 여러
experience and
가지 연단들이
face,
있다라는 거죠.
there are many different disciplines that we
우리를
encounter.
참으로 울게
And
만드는
so there are things that will make us
우리를
cry,
참으로 슬프게
there are
만드는
things that will make
그런
us
일들이
sad,
교회
and
밖에서도 일어나지만 특별히
these
교회
things
안에서도 많이
happen
일어납니다.
outside of the church, but also within the church. And so the thorns of
나이테가 되는
a
거예요.
domination and discipline, they are the rings of faith.
우리가 한
And
해를
so
살아오면서
as
또
we
한
have
해를
lived
거듭
a year
경험하면서
and have experienced another year,
뭐 이런저런 여러 가지
we
일들을
may
만납니다.
have experienced many different
그래서
kinds
두
of
번째 포인트로
events.
가시의 본질.
And so for the second point, the
두
essence
번째
of
포인트로 가시의
thorns,
본질.
the essence of
이거는
thorns.
그 관점에서 은혜를 이제 더
So we will receive more grace
느끼도록
by
하겠습니다.
looking at the
인생의
second
가시는
point.
우리를
And
괴롭게
so
하고 아프게
the thorns
하잖아요.
of life torment us and they make us
그래서 인생의 가시가
in pain. And
이제
so
대부분
the thorns
사람으로
of
나옵니다.
life, they
사람.
appear
사람이
as
사람을 가장
people
피곤하게 만드는
because
거예요.
people are the
사람이
ones that
사람을
give
가장
another
못 살게
person a hard time and make their
곰곰이
lives miserable.
생각해보면
If you think about it
맞는
carefully,
말이죠.
this can
이치
be
있는 일리 있는
true,
이야기죠.
right? And these are
사람이
words
사람을
that
가장
make sense.
아프게 하는
Other
거예요.
people are what make people
어찌됐든 육체의 그 질병도
in
가시
pain.
중에 하나입니다.
And
우리가
physical
질병을 앓으면서
illnesses are also a
그
thorn that we
후유증으로
experienced. And so as we
이
are
몸
sick or
상태가
ill,
안 좋으니까 또는
the
정신
state of our
상태가 안
body is
좋으니까
not good and the
그
state of
후유증으로
our mental health is
이제
not
여러
good. And
가지
so
그 아픈 일을
through
우리가 만나게 됩니다.
these illnesses, we
근데
may become
이
in pain.
시간 우리가
But
알아야 되는 것은
what we
왜
have to know at this
하나님께서
time is
믿는
why
자에게 그런
does God
가시를
grant
허락하시느냐.
the believer this kind of thorn?
분명히 사도 바울이
And
세 번이나
Paul,
기도를 하잖아요.
he prays 3 times.
자기 육체에 있는 가시를
And he prays so
떠나게
that
해달라고.
his thorns may be taken away from him. And he earnestly
그러나
prays for this.
하나님의 응답은
But God,
무엇이었습니까?
what was his response?
내 은혜가
He says,
네게
my grace
족하도다.
is sufficient for you.
그러니까 사람으로
And
하여금
so
자만하지
for
않도록
people, in order
가시를
to
허락하셨다라는 거죠.
make them
왜냐면
not
사도
be
바울은
prideful,
실제 하늘에 갔다 온
God has
사람이에요.
granted these
Third,
thorns.
영어로도 third
And
heaven.
Paul is someone who has gone to
우리는
the third
지금까지
heaven. So we,
이 하늘이 그
the heaven,
1차원의 세계인 줄 알았는데
we just
그런데
thought it
사도 바울은
was
셋째 하늘까지 갔다가 왔다는
the first
거예요.
heaven, but rather we see that Paul has gone all the way to the
다시
third
말해서
heaven. And so in
엄청난
other words,
비밀과
he
엄청난
knows an
계시를
incredible
받았다는 이야기입니다.
secret and he has received incredible knowledge.
그러면
And
그런
if that's the
사람에게
case, to someone
어째서
like
하나님은
this, why would
그런
God
가시를
give a thorn
허락하셨을까?
like this to him?
그래서 성경 보니까
And when we look at the Bible,
받은 계시가 너무 크기 때문에
it says
하나님의
the
세계를
knowledge that he's received
때까지
is
봤기
too
때문에
great. He's seen a world of God And in order to keep him from becoming prideful or arrogant, God has granted him thorns. And so, haven't I said this countless a number of times? Even if someone said to become or to have some pride, we cannot, because that world is just so great. I mean, people, when they see angels, they think they are God and try to bow down before it. But can you imagine seeing actually God? That is how powerful angels are. And so the thorns that refine people, they are tests, and tests come as thorn. And so in order to refine a person, there has to be a test, and through the discipline of the test, you bear the fruit of faith. But in tests, there are two characteristics. Number one, small point one, the test comes in order to love God, and this is found in Deuteronomy 13, verse 3. You shall not listen to the words of that prophet or that dreamer of dreams, for the Lord your God is testing you to know whether you love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. And so you love God, but do you really love God? Do you really love Him with your center, with your core heart? And who is testing you in order to know this? Is it God? Or is it to help you understand through that person? I mean, God already knows, right? So you have to read the Bible carefully. It's not that God doesn't know something and says, I'm going to test you to see whether you really love me or not. That's not the case. The Father already knows, right? And that's why He is the Father. I mean, it's not that because someone confesses something before God that He knows. God already knows. And the reason for that is because He is the first and the last. He is the beginning and the end. And He is the God who is the Alpha and the Omega. Of course He would know. So it's through people, or it's for people to understand, do I really love God? Am I just saying it with my words? Or am I also showing that I love the Father truly through my actions? And that is what God is wanting to show us through the test. Second small point, to bless you. Deuteronomy 8, verse 16. And so in Deuteronomy, there is a great secret. Who fed you in the wilderness with manna that your fathers did not know, that He might humble you and test you to do you good in the end. And so why did God test the Israelites? In order to bless them, to lower us, and in order to make us people who are able to obey and to be blessed. He has given us the test. And so the one who overcomes the test is blessed. The one who falls to the test, they do not receive in the end. And so for point number 3, the grace of thorns. So the thorns of life are not to trample and to crush me, but rather they are to bring or to find us back. And so we have to know the purpose of the thorns. And so we go to work, and there are just so many people who are just giving me such a hard time. Every time I say something, they have to say something back and make my life difficult. And this is the same in the church. In the church, you might have done something with a great intention or a good intention, but when your feelings are hurt, then you completely disregard that thing that you have done. And so that's why the thorns of life, why do we have them? It's in order to find yourself. So those who have lost themselves, they can't understand the will of God and they can't walk with God, right? I mean, if you have lost yourself, how can you walk with the God who is spirit? And so that's why the thorns, simply put, it is love. It is the love of God that is given to us through the thorns. And that's why our bodies are in so much pain. We might think, I am someone that is a believer, but why isn't God healing me? Why isn't He helping me out? And rather, why is He just continuing to grant me this pain? And I said there are two reasons. First, it's in order to love God. You might love God, but do I earnestly and truly and with my whole heart love God? Is it putting your life on the line to love God? Look at Esau. Because he was hungry, he completely disregarded his right as the firstborn. He didn't care about his firstborn right. He was just so hungry he thought he was going to die. And someone like Esau, just because he was slightly uncomfortable or in discomfort, he completely threw away his hope in God. And so why, through some difficulties in life, why does God continue to grant these to us? The first reason is to love God. Although we say that we know God, we can't act according to the word, we can't obey the word. And secondly, it's to bless you. And so in the Bible, who is the one who is blessed? It is the one who fears God. And so the word, so the thorns, whether it's a physical or spiritual thorn, the purpose of the thorn is in order to find yourself again. And this thorn, through this thorn, you bear the fruit of faith. And so for the first small point, you become humble through the thorn. Become humble through the thorn. 2 Corinthians 12, verse 7. So without the thorn, there is no reason for man to be humble. So because you are in pain, you try to look for a solution, right? And so that's why suffering and understanding go together. So without a doubt, suffering and understanding go together. And so this understanding allows us to become humble people. It's through this pain. Because you're in pain, you are humble. Can you be in pain but be cursing and lashing out at others and making up false accusations against others? And so the world, in the world, there are so many people like this. They are shaken just a little bit and they will just lash out. And so the grace that Apostle Paul had received was so great that in order for him to not be conceited, God had granted him these thorns. And so second small point, we realize God's grace through the thorns. 2 Corinthians 12 verses 8 through 9. And so the grace of God, it is abundant or abounding. In other words, it's also overflowing.
근데 사도 바울이가
But Apostle
이 육체의
Paul,
가시가 고통이 너무 크니까
he
이거
said
좀
that the
해결해 달라고
thorn was just too
하나님께
great for
그렇게
him, and
기도를
so he
하는데
prays to God to
하나님은
please take it
오히려
away from
아니야.
him. But God
그거를
instead
내가
says, no,
너에게서 그를 떠나게 할 수가 없어.
I can't remove this thorn from you.
왜냐하면
And the reason for
그
that
육체의
is
가시가
because
너에게서 떠나면
if that
너는
thorn
반드시
goes away from
자만하게 된다.
you, then you will become conceited.
아버지께서 아시니까 그렇게
And
말씀하신 거죠.
God
그렇잖아요.
says this because he already
그러니까 사도
knows.
바울이
And
깨달은 게
so what
엄청난
Paul
깨달은
had
거예요.
understood was a great
다
understanding.
봤다니까.
He saw
사도 바울이가.
everything.
봤기 때문에
Because he
뭐라고
saw
자신 있게 얘기를
this,
했냐면은
what he said with
우리가 지금
confidence
받는
was,
이 환난은
this
장차 우리가 체험할 그
tribulation
영광에
that
비하면
we are
아무것도
experiencing
아니다.
right now, if we actually compare to what
그런
is
이야기를
coming
한
for us,
거예요.
it is absolutely nothing. And that is what he
신의 성품을
confessed.
봤다니까요. 사도
And
바울이가
Paul
보고 갔다
saw
와서
the
이
divine
이야기를 한
nature,
거예요.
he saw it and experienced it, and he
하나님께서
came back
육체의
and
가시를
said this.
왜
And so
주셨느냐?
why did God give him this
자만해지니까.
thorn? It's because otherwise he would
그
become
사람은
conceited.
알면은 또
And so
교만해진다니까요.
man, as soon as they know something,
모르는
they
사람은
become
교만할 수가 없죠.
arrogant. Someone who doesn't know, they
근데
can't be arrogant.
알면은
But if
어떤
you do
사람은
know
움찔됩니다.
something, they become
아니까.
conceited because they know something.
마지막 작은 세 번째로 세
And
번째
lastly,
포인트의
third
작은 세
small
번째로
point of the
가시를
third
통해서
point. Through the
자기의
thorns,
강함을 버리고
you
약함을
forsake
자랑한다.
your strength and boast of your weakness.
가시를 통해서
So through the
자기의
thorn, you
강함을
forsake
버리고
your strength
약함을
and boast
자랑한다.
of your weakness.
솔직히
And
우리
so,
중에 우리의 못난 거를 자랑하고 싶은
truthfully
사람이 있을까요?
speaking, is there anyone around us who wants to talk about our weaknesses?
내가 내를 봐도 내가
When I
내
look at
자신을 봐도
myself
이
and
부분만큼은 참으로 숨기고 싶은.
there are things that
자,
you
예를
want to
들자면
hide about
과거사가
yourself.
있어요.
For
과거.
example, you have a
사람마다 다
past.
과거가
Everyone
있습니다.
has a past.
그 없다고 말하면은 우리가
And
다
if you say that
하나님을
you don't,
우리가
then
거짓말
we
자기로 다
are
보는
being
거예요.
liars before God.
우리에게는
We
너나 할
all,
것 없이
you
부끄러운
and me,
과거사가
all
있습니다.
of us, we
근데
have
그거
embarrassing
알리고
or
싶으세요?
shameful past. But do
영어로
you
public
want
announcement,
to publicly
PA.
announce this past to everyone?
그 회사에다 알리고
You
교회에다
want
알리고
to
내
inform your
아내, 내 남편
company or your
알리고 싶으세요?
church, your husband or your wife?
숨기고
Do
싶은 게
you
있다라는 거죠.
want to announce these things? You want to
그렇죠?
hide them, right?
그런데 이
But
사도 바울이 뭐라고
what
얘기하냐면
Paul says is,
자기가 은혜를 깨닫기 전에는
before
자기의 강함을
I
자랑했어요.
understood grace,
난
I
이런
would just
사람이다.
boast about
좀 알아줘야
my
되겠다.
strengths. I am someone like this, and you
나는
should acknowledge
베냐민
me.
지파
I
사람이고
am from the tribe of
베냐민
Benjamin,
지파라는 것은 이제
and
왕족
what that
출신을
means
말하는
is
거거든요.
you were
왜냐하면은
royalty, or you were
이스라엘의
from
초대 왕이
the royal
이
line,
베냐민
because
지파에서 나왔거든요.
the first king came
그러니까
from the tribe of
나는
Benjamin.
베냐민
And so
사람이다.
Paul would say,
나는 왕족
I am a
출신이다.
person of the Benjamin tribe. I
나는
am
태어난 지
royalty. When
8일
I
만에
was
할례를
born,
받았다.
within
다시
8
말해서
days, I received
정통
circumcision. And
히브리인이라는
so
것을
what that
증명하는 거죠.
means, I am a traditional Hebrew.
나는 뭐 그 잡족이 아니고 나는
I'm
순수한 피를 이어받은 사람이다.
not
나는
just
베냐민
some
사람이고 나는
normal
순수한
commoner,
히브리
but
사람이고
rather I am a traditional Hebrew from the tribe of
그리고 나는
Benjamin,
율법을
and I'm
한
royalty.
번도 어긴 적이 없다.
And I
율법에
have
대해서는 흠이 없는
never
사람이다.
not
다시
kept
말해서
the
나는
law.
율법을
I always
완벽하게
kept the law. I
지켰다.
perfectly keep the law.
그리고
And
이 사도 바울이 세상적으로도 엄청난
from the worldly perspective, Paul,
대단한 교육을 받은
he
사람이에요.
also was
지금으로
highly
말하자면은
educated. And so if
이제
we're talking
하버드
about
나왔다라는 거죠.
today's terms, he
뭐
was
프린스턴이나 예일이나
maybe a
뭐
Harvard,
MIT나 뭐 다
Princeton,
거기서
Yale, or MIT
Johns
graduate,
Hopkins나.
or Johns Hopkins. They're all great
다
schools.
대단한
They're
학교들이에요.
all highly regarded.
그런데 이 사람이
But what this person
자기의 그
says
강함을
is,
이제 이렇게 나열하다가
as he's boasting about
자기의
himself and his
그러니까
strengths,
다시 말하자면 위대함과 뛰어남을 이제 자랑하는
he
거죠.
is,
그러나
again, he's
은혜를
boasting
깨닫는
about what
순간부터는
is
자기의 강함을
strength,
버렸어요.
what is strong about him. But
배설물로 여겼습니다.
as soon as he received grace,
배설물,
he
filth.
regarded his strengths
Garbage.
as nothing or garbage or
그리고
filth.
자기의 약함을 자랑하기
And
시작합니다.
rather, he starts to boast of his weakness.
그래,
He says,
나 그거 할 줄 모르는데.
sure, I don't know
나
how
그거
to
잘
do that.
모르겠는데.
I don't know what the
모르는
answer
게
to
많은 사람이야.
that is. I am
내가 다
someone
안다고
who
생각하지 마.
doesn't
나 모르는
know
게 더 많아. 내가 아는
everything.
것보다 난 모르는 게 더 많은 사람이야.
There are more things that I don't know than I
그리고
actually
나는,
know. And
굉장히 아픈 사람이야.
I am also someone who
내 건강은
is in a lot of pain.
그야말로
My
좋지
health
않고
is not very good.
나는
And
그 신체적으로 여러 군데가 전국적으로
physically, in
나는
many
굉장히 아픈
different
사람이야.
aspects, I am in a
자기의
lot of
약함을
pain.
드디어
And so
자랑하기 시작합니다.
finally, he begins to boast of all of
그
his
사람은요,
weaknesses. And so a
약해야
person,
돼요.
they have to be weak.
사람이 약해야
A person must be weak
자기보다 강한 분을 찾게
in
됩니다.
order to look for the one who is stronger
그래서
than
가장
himself.
위대하신
And
분이
so
하나님이잖아요.
the one who
하나님보다
is
강한 분은 없잖아요.
the most great is God. There's no one
그
that's
사람은
greater than God.
약해야
And
돼요.
so that's why man
사람이
has to be
강하면 못
weak.
씁니다.
If man is strong,
왜냐면
then
일주일되면서 자기를
they
이야기한다니까.
are
나는 이런
worthless
것도
because
해봤고,
otherwise
나는 저런
they
것도
just start
해봤고.
to boast about themselves and they say, I've done this, I've done that.
많은 사람은 없을 걸.
There's no one who is
그런
smarter than
사람은요,
me. And so
절대로
someone like
하나님을
this,
알 수가 없어요.
they cannot know
자기로 차여
God
있기 때문에.
because they are so full of themselves.
그래서
And
인생의
so
가시가 있기 때문에
because
하나님을
there
찾게
is
되고 기도하게
the
되는
thorn
것입니다.
of life, you begin to search for
바로
God
그것이
and pray.
우리를
And
향하신
that
하나님께서
is
우리에게 허락하신 가시의
the thorn that God
그
has
본질이에요.
granted to
그러니까
us, and
가시는
that is the
하나님의
essence
은혜이자
of the
사랑입니다.
thorn. And so
결론으로
the thorn
하나님은
is grace
가시
and it
같은
is God's
나를
love.
택하셨습니다.
And so God has
알고 보니까
chosen
내가
a
가시였던
thorn
거예요.
like myself. And so as you
나는
begin to
지금까지
reflect, you
남이
understand
나를
that
못 살게 하는
I
줄
was the
알았는데.
thorn. I used to think others were
근데
the
말씀의
ones who
은혜를
bothered
받아보니까
me or
말씀의
gave me
눈으로
pain.
보니까
But
사실은
as I began to understand the word, I
내가
realized in reality, I
남에게
am the one
여러 가지로
in many ways
못할 짓을 했다라는 거죠.
have done
왜?
very
내가 정죄했거든요.
bad things. And the
마음으로
reason for that
정죄하고,
is
눈으로
because
정죄하고, 입으로 정죄하고.
I gave them pain through the things I
한 번도 그런 적이
said
없다고요?
or looked or the way I
진짜로?
looked or
한 번도
acted.
사람 판단해
Can
본 적
you
없어요?
truly say that
그 왜
you have never
흥분합니까?
judged another? Then
흥분하잖아요.
why
한숨
would
팍팍
you
쉬면서. 그 왜 흥분하냐고. 팩트를 제대로 알면은
accuse if you know the
흥분하는
right
자체가 그게 잘못된 거예요.
facts? Accusing is wrong
가장 흥분해 하실 분은 아버지거든요.
because God is the only one who can
근데 벌써
truly
한숨부터 쉽니다.
say the truth. And so from the start, you just begin to put out a deep
내가 아는
sigh.
것은
The things that you know,
전체적으로 아는 게 아니라니까요.
it is not everything.
그 자만하지 마세요, 여러분.
So
여러분이
do
안다는
not
게
come to quick
동서남북으로
conclusions.
완벽하게 아는 게
The
아닙니다,
things
여러분.
that you may know,
내가 아는 거는
it is
어떤
not the
한 면을 본
complete
거예요.
truth.
어느 날, 어느
You
순간,
may
어떤
have just
때에,
seen
어떤 장소에서
one
어떤 면을
aspect.
본 거예요.
You may have seen a
다 본
certain
것이 아니라.
situation in a certain time, place,
하나님은
and
다
setting,
보셨습니다,
but you have
이미.
not seen the full story.
그래서
But God has already
사실은
seen the
우리는
full story.
못쓸
So
가시 같은
that is why
인생들이었는데
truly we were
그런
just
우리를
thorns
하나님께서
that
더
were
사랑해 주셨다는 거예요. 왜?
of no use, but rather God has loved us even more.
내가
And
너를
why?
사랑해.
It's because God
너는 가시로
loves
끝날
us,
인생이
and
아니야.
He says that we
내가
are not
너에게 둔
lives that will just
뜻이
end
있어.
like a thorn. He has a
그거를 넌
purpose and a
깨달으면
will
돼.
for us. And if you just
그러면
understand that,
사람이
then you are
깨달은
set.
순간부터는
And so the moment
그
man
골로새서
understands,
1장을 보세요.
look at
열매를
Colossians
맺는다고
1,
했잖아요.
they
골로새서
begin to
1장에.
bear fruit.
은혜를 깨닫는 순간부터
So the
자,
moment,
읽어봅니다.
let's all read this together.
그러니까 사람은요.
And so man,
자기를 내려놓는 순간부터
the moment they
믿음이
lower
시작하는
themselves, that's when faith
거예요. 그래서
begins.
믿음이 위대한 겁니다.
And that is why faith is so great.
내가 뭔가 안다라는 거 다 내려놓으세요.
Lower the things
내가
that you
알아봐야
think that you
얼마나
know. If you know something, I mean, how much
맞아요.
could you possibly know?
아버지 앞에서는 뭐
Before
안다라는 이야기하면은 그게 죄가 되는 거예요.
The Father, you can't say that you know something because otherwise it would be a sin.
저의 첫 번째 고백이 그거였습니다.
That was
제가
my
은혜를
first
체험하면서
confession once I
아버지는
received
위대하시다.
grace.
아버지는
My confession
영원하시다.
was the
아버지가
Father
참되시다.
is eternal and He is
그거를
great
수천 번
and
제가
He is good.
고백했어요.
And I just kept on
은혜를
repeating that
처음에
over and over
체험하면서부터.
again when I first experienced grace.
놀라운 세계예요. 하나님의 세계가.
It is such an
그런
incredible
세계를
world, the
봤기
world
때문에
of God. And
교만하라
because
그래도 그래서 교만 안 한다니까. 왜 교만합니까?
if you
도대체.
have seen a world like this, you
교만할
cannot
이유가
be
없는
arrogant
거예요, 교만할.
even if you want to be
아니
arrogant.
우리가
And
잘 돼서 좋은 데 가야지.
we all want to
그렇잖아요.
become good and go to a
자,
good place,
골로새서
right?
지금
So Colossians
1장
1,
여기 뭐라고 나와 있냐면은
what it says
열매를 맺는다는
is
거예요. 깨닫는 순간부터.
that the moment you understand, you will bear fruit.
자, 6절이죠.
So it's verse 6.
Colossians 1:6. 여기 그 성경에 보니까
So Colossians 1:6
이
says,
복음이 이미
that has
너희에게
come to
이름에
you
너희가
all
듣고
over the world.
참으로
This
하나님의
gospel is
은혜를
bearing
깨달은
fruit and
날부터
growing
너희
just as it
중에서와
has been doing
같이
among
또한
you since the
온
day you
천하에서도
heard it and
열매를
understood God's
자라는도다.
grace and all its truth.
사실을
And so
이겨낸 거죠.
he has overcome the thorns. How?
사실을 이겨냈으니까 깨달은
Because
거죠.
he has overcome the
이겨내지
thorns,
못했으면은
he has been able to
원망과
understand. If you have not
저주와
overcome your thorns,
불평과
then all you do is
불만에
have
그냥
resentment
쪄들어 있는
and
거예요.
complaints
근데
and
가시의 본질을
disappointments.
깨달은 거예요. 어느
But
순간.
at one point, he has
그러니까
understood
감사가 되는 거죠.
the purpose
그렇잖아요.
of the thorn, and that is why
우리는요,
thanksgiving results.
우리는
And so
믿음으로 우리는 주 안에서 부활한 사람들입니다.
we are people who have resurrected in
시작이
Christ
부활이에요.
again by faith,
우리는 부활로
and
시작한 사람들입니다.
the start of faith is by resurrection. We have begun
그런데
by
믿음의
resurrection,
끝은 뭐냐 할
but
때
the end
변화죠.
of
변화의
faith,
세계예요.
it is transfiguration. It's the
그래서
world of
범사에
transfiguration. And
말씀과
so
기도를
that
해야
is
되는
why
겁니다.
we
범사에.
must at all times
왜냐하면
give prayer
사단은
and thanksgiving.
마귀는
And the reason for that is because Satan,
약한
the
자를
devil,
찾아 돌아다닌대요.
goes around looking for the one who is
쉴
weak,
새 없이
and he does this tirelessly,
쉬지 않고.
without ceasing.
그래서
And
범사에
so
감사하라는
that's
이유가
why
바로
you
그겁니다.
must
감사하지
always
못하죠?
be thankful.
반드시 불평하게
And
되고
if you're unable
원망하게
to
되는
give
거예요.
thanks, then you will
감사하지 못하면.
just fall into giving complaints
교회에서
and
직분을
resentment.
받을 때,
So
어떤
when you
직책을
receive
받을 때,
some type of position in the
그거를
church,
만약에 믿음으로
if you
받았다면은
receive it by faith,
그건 끝까지 그
then
자리를
until
지키는
the
겁니다.
end, you have to keep that position.
뭐 이해가 안 되네, 뭐
Even
이러네
if you don't
저러네 하면서
understand,
그건
or
벌써
if you
교회가
just
그러면
continue
이제
to just
조직이 되는 거고
complain
단체가
about
되는
it,
거거든요.
then
그러니까
the
교회는
church
뭐냐 할 때
becomes
인격이에요, 인격.
weaker, and the church is a
교회를
character.
인격체로
You
우리가
must
모셔야 되는 거예요.
serve the church as a character.
하나님의 몸 아닙니까?
And
교회라는
isn't it the body of God,
뜻이
the church?
주님의 몸이에요.
It is the
교회는.
body of
그래서
Christ.
교회는
And so that's
섬기는
why
곳입니다.
the
내가
church
가진
is a
돈,
place that
내가
you
가진
serve
시간, 내가
with the
가진
money,
어떤 탤런트,
the
지식, 기술,
time,
경험,
the
이런
knowledge,
거를
the
다 가져다가
talents, and the skills that you have.
하나님의
You
뜻을
bring
위해서
these
내가
things
그것을
and
바쳐드리는 거예요.
you
다시
serve
말해서
it
헌신하는
and
거죠.
you put it before God.
Devotion.
And that is why you devote these
Commitment.
things to God.
그래서 하나님을 위해서
And so
나를
for
바치는
God,
거예요.
you are giving
그래서
yourself.
우리 교회
And
이제
so in our
교인이 되신
church,
분들은
there are people who
다 일거리를
become
저는 다 드립니다.
members of our church,
노는
and as
사람은
soon as that
없어요.
happens, I give them a
이런 일
position to
저런 일
work in the church. There's no
제가
one that
일일이
does nothing.
물어봐가지고 또는 제가
I
임의로
will
이거
at times
해라,
call them
저거
out by
해라.
name, or I'll ask them to do certain
노는 사람은
tasks.
없습니다.
There's
저희
no one
교회에서.
who
다 뭔가
doesn't do
하나씩
anything. They all
어떤
have
직책이나
some type
어떤
of
책임을
role
지고
or some type of
이렇게
responsibility
말씀을 위해서 사역하고 있는 거예요.
to work for
네,
the
여러분,
word. And so
가시의 은혜란 도대체 나를 어떻게 만드는 거냐?
this thorn that is grace, what does it do to
영성이
us?
있는, 영성이 깊은, 그리고
It
하나님과
is
함께하는 그러한 훌륭한 사람으로 만들어 줍니다.
what refines us to being the great person that will be eternal
주시는
with God.
은혜가
So let us
과연
all
헛되지
pray.
않아서